The forest was quiet that night, the kind of silence that only comes after a long rain. Henry Cole, 68 years old, sat alone on the porch of his small wooden cabin. The storm had passed, leaving the world soaked and still. Only the soft drip of water from the pine branches broke the silence. He sipped from a tin cup of coffee, his eyes wandering through the fog that drifted low across the trees. The lantern beside him flickered faintly, its light reaching only a few feet into the dark. Then, something moved. At first, Henry thought it was just a deer, but the shape was too tall, too heavy. A massive figure crossed between the trees, slow and deliberate, like it carried a burden. Henry stood, hand resting on the porch post, squinting through the mist. The moon broke through the clouds for only a second, and that's when he saw it clearly. A giant covered in dark, rain-matted fur. But what froze his breath wasn't its size. It was what it held. In the creature's arms lay something small, limp, pale against its chest. The shape of a child, a Bigfoot infant, lifeless. The creature stopped at the edge of the clearing, bowed its massive head and let out a deep, mournful sound, half cry, half hum, that seemed to shake the trees themselves. Henry felt something twist in his chest. This wasn't rage or wildness. It was grief. His voice came out in a whisper, barely audible above the wind. That wasn't a beast. That was a father mourning his child. The rain began again, soft and steady, as the creature vanished back into the darkness. Morning came gray and cold, the mist still clinging to the ground. Henry hadn't slept. The image of what he'd seen, that giant figure holding its lifeless child, haunted him through the night. With his old ranger's instinct guiding him, Henry pulled on his boots, grabbed his lantern and walking stick, and stepped into the wet forest. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. He moved carefully toward the tree line where he'd seen the creature the night before. The mud was thick, heavy beneath his feet. And then he saw them. Footprints. Enormous, deep impressions, pressed clean into the ground. Too wide to be human, too long to be bare. Each step sank inches deep, leading away from the clearing toward the creek. Henry crouched, tracing one print with trembling fingers. The size of it made him feel small, but what struck him more was the pattern. Slow, deliberate, not the erratic trail of an animal running in fear. As he followed, the forest grew quieter. Near the water's edge, he found a darker patch of soil, faint streaks of blood, small, not much more than a few drops. Something about it told him it wasn't from a hunt. That night, Henry didn't even try to sleep. He left his lantern on the window ledge, eyes fixed on the woods. Around midnight, movement stirred again, a shape emerging from the fog. The creature had returned. Henry's heart pounded, but he didn't move. Through the thin veil of rain, he saw it kneel beside the creek. The Bigfoot held the small body, the infant in its hands, cradling it with impossible tenderness. It dipped its hands into the water, gently washing the child's fur as if cleansing it one final time. No violence. No rage, just sorrow. Henry's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't watching a monster, he was witnessing a ritual. A father saying farewell. As the creature lifted its face toward the dark sky, letting out a low, trembling hum, Henry whispered the truth only his heart could accept. He wasn't hiding from us. He was saying goodbye. The next day, sunlight broke weakly through the clouds, washing the forest in a pale gold haze. Henry stood on his porch, his old ranger's jacket zipped to his chin, staring at the line of trees that now felt different, alive with something he couldn't explain. He couldn't shake what he'd seen. That sound, that sorrow. It didn't belong to a creature of instinct. It belonged to a being that felt. So, against his better judgment, he took his walking stick and set out again. The ground was soft underfoot, every step sinking slightly into damp soil. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional crow and the drip of melting rain from the branches above. Henry followed the same trail from the night before, tracing the giant footprints along the creek until they curved deeper into the woods. There, the terrain dipped into a hollow, and that's when he saw it, a mound of freshly turned earth. Not large, but carefully shaped. Around it were wildflowers, wilted but placed with intention, and a ring of smooth river stones. He froze, hat in hand, a lump forming in his throat. It wasn't random. It was a burial. He knelt beside the mound, touching one of the stones. It was still damp from the rain, and beneath his palm he felt the faint warmth of the sun breaking through the canopy. His mind drifted back to his ranger days, to stories whispered by hunters and old-timers, tales of a gentle giant who used to roam these parts. One that raided gardens for apples but never harmed a soul. Maybe it had a mate, maybe even a family, hidden all this time, surviving quietly in the shadows. Henry sat there for a long moment, hat resting in his lap, staring at the grave. He felt an ache in his chest, the kind he'd felt when he lost his wife years ago, a father burying a child in the cold earth. Alone. The thought hollowed him out. It didn't matter if it had fur or skin, fangs or teeth. Grief, he realized, was universal. As he rose to leave, he looked back once more and whispered softly to the empty woods, "Grief is the same, no matter the shape of the hands that hold it." The forest always changed after sunset. Sounds grew deeper, slower, like the world itself was holding its breath. That night, Henry Cole found himself standing at the edge of the same hollow lantern in hand. Its flame turned low. He shouldn't have been there. Every part of his mind told him to stay home, but something in his heart pulled him back. He moved carefully between the trees, his boots sinking softly into the damp earth. When he reached the clearing, he crouched behind a thick cedar trunk and waited. The night air smelled of pine and wet soil. A steady wind whispered through the branches. Then, movement. A shape emerged from the darkness, huge and deliberate. The Bigfoot stepped into the clearing, its fur glistening faintly under the moonlight. It looked older tonight, slower, like grief had weight. In its massive hand it held a small bundle of wildflowers, their petals dim and trembling in the breeze. Henry's breath caught as the creature knelt beside the small mound. It placed the flowers on top of the earth one by one, with a tenderness Henry had only seen in the quiet moments between a father and child. The creature bowed its head, shoulders trembling slightly, and a low sound came from its chest, not a growl but something softer, almost human. Then it stopped, its head turned slowly. Its gaze found Henry in the dark. For a moment neither of them moved. The lantern flame flickered weakly, casting trembling shadows across the trees. Henry swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, friend." The creature's amber eyes glistened. They weren't wild, they were weary. It looked at him for several long seconds, unblinking, breathing heavy but calm. Then with one slow motion it placed a hand over the mound, pressing lightly against the soil as if saying, "Remember, no threat, no sound, just understanding." Henry stood still until the creature slowly turned and disappeared into the forest mist, its footsteps fading into silence. He stayed there long after it was gone, his lantern flickering low beside the grave. For the first time in his life, Henry felt small. Not from fear, but from reverence. He realized he hadn't just seen a creature. He had been trusted to witness a sacred goodbye. The forest was quiet again by morning, heavy with fog that clung to the low branches. Henry didn't sleep that night. The image of those amber eyes wouldn't leave his mind. The way the creature had looked at him, not as a threat but as a fellow mourner. By sunrise, he packed his old canvas satchel and headed back toward the ridge. He needed to know more. Where the creature came from, where it went after the burial. The ranger in him sought answers. The man in him sought understanding. The path grew narrow and rough, thick roots twisting like old bones under his boots. The forest here felt older, untouched. He followed broken branches and faint footprints pressed deep in the mud until they led him to the base of a rocky slope. There, half hidden behind wild vines, was a dark opening. A cave. He hesitated, heart pounding softly against his chest, then stepped inside. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of moss and damp earth. His lantern light brushed across the walls, and what he saw stopped him cold. A corner lined with soft materials, pine needles, ferns, bits of fur, shaped into a makeshift nest. Scattered around it were berry stems, cracked nuts, and the bones of small animals carefully piled together. There was no chaos, no savagery, only signs of life, of care, of survival. Then Henry turned toward the far wall and froze. There, pressed into the dried mud, were handprints. Dozens of them, large, powerful prints that could only belong to the creature he'd seen. But beside them were smaller ones, tiny, delicate, the shape of a child's hand. Henry stepped closer, running his trembling fingers over the faint impressions. They were old but clear. He imagined the scene, the infant pressing its hand into the wall, the parent guiding it gently, just as any father might do. A lump rose in his throat. He knelt slowly on the cave floor, hat clutched to his chest. The truth was undeniable now. This wasn't a monster's den. It was a home. He stayed there for a long moment, surrounded by silence and the smell of earth, feeling something shift deep inside him. For the first time in years, he whispered a prayer, not for himself but for them, for the one who mourned, for the one who'd been lost. His voice was barely audible, breaking the still air. Even the wild ones have hearts that break. The words echoed faintly against the cave walls, lingering like a promise between two worlds, one seen, one forgotten. The night came heavy with rain, the kind that soaked the ground until it glistened like glass. Henry sat by his cabin window for a long time, staring into the dark, knowing what he needed to do. Before midnight, he gathered a few things: his lantern, a small carving knife, and a piece of cedar wood from the pile beside his porch. He wasn't a religious man, but he knew the meaning of remembrance. Slowly, he shaped the wood into a simple cross. Plain, no markings, no names, just something to say. Someone cared. By the time he reached the burial site, the rain had eased to a steady drizzle. The mound of earth looked peaceful, covered now with wildflowers placed by unseen hands. Henry knelt beside it, driving the small wooden cross into the soil. He didn't say much. Words felt too small for what he'd witnessed. Instead, he bowed his head and let the silence speak. He turned to leave, and then he heard it, a soft, heavy breath behind him. He froze, heart tightening in his chest. Slowly, he turned his lantern. There, just beyond the edge of the light, stood Bigfoot. The creature's massive frame was streaked with rain, its fur dark and dripping, its eyes catching the faint glow of the lantern. It wasn't growling, it wasn't angry, it was simply there, watching him. In its right hand, it held something small, a smooth stone carved in the rough shape of a bird. Henry realized it was a toy. The infant's toy. The creature stepped forward, silent but deliberate, until it stood a few feet away from the grave. It looked at the cross, then at Henry. For a long, still moment, the two just stared, man and myth bound by the same ache of loss. Henry lowered his head, hat pressed to his chest. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice breaking. "You're not alone." Bigfoot knelt, slow, almost reverent, and placed the stone bird beside the cross. Its great hand lingered there for a moment, tracing the soil with a tenderness that no one would ever believe possible. Then it made a sound, deep and trembling, half growl, half cry. That seemed to come from somewhere ancient, a place beyond words. It wasn't rage. It was mourning. Henry felt his eyes burn. He wanted to say more, but the words wouldn't come. There was nothing left to say. The creature looked at him one last time. Then, with a faint nod, a gesture of understanding, it turned back toward the forest. The rain swallowed its figure until it vanished into the mist, leaving only the sound of water and wind. Henry stood there alone, his lantern flickering weakly in the damp air. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. What lingered in that clearing wasn't fear. It was something far older, far gentler, the silent bond of two souls who understood what it meant to lose someone you love. Weeks passed. The forest had begun to change. The heavy rains had ended, and a cool hush settled over the valley. Mist curled low between the trees, and the mornings carried that quiet stillness Henry had always loved. But even now, every time he stepped outside, he found his eyes drifting toward the direction of the burial site. One afternoon, he finally went back. He took his time walking. The air smelled of wet pine and soil, and the only sounds were the crows somewhere in the distance. The path was familiar now, each footprint softened by weeks of rain. When he reached the clearing, he stopped. The grave was still there, small, almost blending into the earth around it. Moss had begun to grow at the edges, soft and green, as if the forest itself was tucking the child to rest. The wildflowers had wilted but still clung to their stems, and beside the small wooden cross lay the stone bird, untouched right where Bigfoot had left it. Henry knelt beside it, resting his hand on the damp ground. There was no sign that the creature had returned. No new tracks, no broken branches, nothing disturbed. For a moment he felt a pang of sadness at that thought. Then he understood. Maybe Bigfoot had finally said its goodbye. The forest had taken the child back, as it always does. Henry sat there for a while, letting the quiet wash over him. There was peace in that silence, not the uneasy kind, but the kind that comes when something sacred has ended the way it was meant to. He looked at the cross again, then at the little stone bird. A faint smile crossed his weathered face. "Grief doesn't belong to humans alone," he murmured. "It's nature's oldest language." The words carried softly into the mist, like they were meant for someone, or something, listening. Before leaving, Henry placed a small bundle of wildflowers beside the grave, the same kind he had seen Bigfoot carry that night. It felt right, a simple gesture of respect, one last connection between two souls who had never spoken, yet somehow understood one another. As he stood and turned to walk home, fog began to roll in from the ridge, wrapping the forest in pale gray. The trees swayed gently as if bowing in farewell. Henry glanced back one last time. The clearing looked calm, almost holy in its stillness, a secret shared between man and nature, left undisturbed. He walked the path home slowly, the lantern light flickering through the mist. There was no fear anymore, no disbelief, no mystery to chase, only understanding. That night, as he sat on his porch, Henry looked toward the dark line of trees and whispered, "Rest easy, my friend." And for the first time in a long while, the forest felt alive, and not with movement but with peace. Months slipped quietly into one another. The storms faded, the trees shed their leaves, and winter crept gently over the valley. Henry never spoke of that night. Not to the sheriff, not to his old ranger friends, not to anyone in town. Some things, he decided, weren't meant for stories or explanations. Some things were meant to stay untouched, like an unbroken trail deep in the woods. He went about his days as usual, chopping wood, fixing the porch railing, feeding the birds that gathered near his cabin. But every evening, when the light began to fade and the first stars shimmered through the branches, he would find himself looking toward the forest. He no longer looked with fear or curiosity. Now it was something softer, a kind of knowing. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of the path, he imagined the creature still walked, not carrying a burden, not a body, but a memory. Sometimes he thought he could almost hear it, that same low, mournful sound echoing faintly in the distance. But it never frightened him. It only reminded him that the wild has its own ways of grieving and its own ways of healing. On one of those quiet nights, Henry opened his old ranger notebook. The pages were yellowed, the handwriting faint and careful. He wrote slowly with the weight of truth behind every word. "If I learned anything out there, it's that love doesn't end. It just changes form." He closed the notebook and set it beside the lantern. The light flickered softly against the cabin walls, warm and steady. Outside, the forest stood still, no longer the eerie place it once was. The wind moved gently through the pines, whispering against the branches like a song only he could understand. Henry smiled faintly, breathing in the cold air through the open window. Whatever had happened out there, it had changed something, not just in the woods, but in him. For the first time in years, the old ranger felt peace, the kind that doesn't come from answers, but from understanding. Something ancient had finally rested. A soft drizzle swept through the trees as dawn broke, gray and gentle. Henry's boots sank into the wet earth with each slow step. He carried only a lantern, its dim, flickering glow cutting through the mist like a small heartbeat in the dark. The forest was quiet now. No movement, no distant cries, only the steady rhythm of rain against leaves and the faint hum of the creek nearby. Henry reached the grave, the mound still neat, the moss greener than before, the little stone bird still resting beside the wooden cross. Time had softened everything here, even the grief that once hung heavy in the air. He knelt, brushing away a few wet leaves from the grave. His hand lingered on the cold surface of the stones. The rain rolled down his sleeve, glistening under the lantern light. In a low whisper, he said, "Sleep well, little one." For a long moment, he just stayed there, head bowed, the lantern's flame trembling against the rain. The forest seemed to breathe with him, alive yet calm, as though it too remembered. Then, as if guided by memory, the imagined camera of the story drifts slowly upward. The scene widens, tall pines swaying gently in the fog, soft light spilling across the clearing, the single glow of Henry's lantern marking a sacred place beneath the trees. The narration turns quiet, solemn, almost a prayer. We think the wild is full of monsters, but maybe it's where love hides longest. Henry stands, his silhouette framed against the mist, and takes one last look before walking back toward his cabin. The rain grows heavier, but he doesn't hurry. As the scene fades, his voice, or perhaps the forest's own echo, carries the final haunting truth. He wasn't a monster. He was a father, mourning what even time couldn't take away.